I stood beside my mother at the council table, my hands resting lightly on the wood. The room smelled of old paper and floor polish the way county courthouses always do. My father leaned back in his chair and looked me up and down, taking his time. "Nice suit," he sneered, trying to look important. A ripple of laughter moved through the benches behind us. I felt my mother's shoulder tighten beneath my palm. I didn't look at him. I kept my eyes on the seal behind the bench. The judge adjusted his glasses and glanced at the file. Then he looked up. "Ms. Morgan," he said evenly, "who do you represent?" I rose. "My mother, Your Honor." The laughter stopped. My father turned ghost white. That was the moment everyone would remember. But it wasn't the beginning. The morning had started quietly, the way mornings do when you're trying not to think too far ahead. I parked on the far side of the lot and walked with my mother across the cracked pavement. She wore a navy cardigan she'd had for years, the sleeves frayed at the cuffs. I carried a thin leather briefcase, no logos, no brass corners, nothing to draw attention. I'd chosen my suit carefully gray-tailored but plain, the kind a working lawyer wears when she expects to blend in. Inside, the clerk nodded at us without recognition. The security guard waved us through. It was a small-town court, not some grand marble hall, and everyone knew everyone, or thought they did. My father was already there with his attorney, a man who smiled too easily, and spoke in a voice that assumed agreement. They sat close together, heads inclined like partners in a long habit. My father glanced up and smirked. That was when he said it. That was when he decided what he thought I was. He had always been good at deciding who people were. As we waited for the docket to be called, my mind slipped back years to a kitchen table scarred by coffee rings and small arguments. My father at the head, my mother standing at the sink listening. Decisions were announced, not discussed. He believed authority came from volume and certainty. I learned early to be quiet. I learned to listen. When I left for college, he told everyone I was finding myself. When I stayed gone, he said I was stubborn. When I went to law school, he said it was a phase. I didn't correct him. I didn't need his approval, and I didn't need his understanding. I needed time. The bailiff called the case. Chairs scraped. We stood. The judge took the bench, a man with a tired face and careful eyes. He asked the attorneys to state their appearances. My father's lawyer spoke first, smooth and confident, listing credentials like a resume read aloud. The judge nodded and turned toward us. "Ms. Morgan," he said, scanning the file, "who do you represent?" I felt my mother inhale. I stood, straightened my jacket, and spoke. "My mother, Your Honor." There was a beat of silence that felt longer than it was. My father's mouth opened, then closed. Color drained from his face. The judge nodded once and made a note. "All right," he said, "let's proceed." We did. But before the arguments, before the exhibits and the careful language, there was that stillness, the recognition that the room had misjudged the balance of power. Not power in the loud sense my father favored, but the quiet kind that comes from preparation. I had prepared for this for months. Not in secret from my mother, she knew, but quietly without announcements. I reviewed bank statements and property records, the slow accumulation of years. I listened to her stories the way I used to listen as a child, except now I knew which details mattered. I explained gently what the law did and didn't promise. I never promised victory. I promised fairness. As the hearing unfolded, my father's confidence ebbed. He interrupted once and was reminded to speak through counsel. He shifted in his chair. His attorney adjusted strategy on the fly. The judge asked questions that went to the heart of the matter: commingled funds, unequal access, years of decisions made by one spouse alone. I spoke when it was my turn. I spoke slowly. I used plain language. I addressed the court, not my father. I watched my mother's hands unclench. When the judge recessed, we stepped into the hallway. My father avoided my eyes. My mother leaned against the wall and laughed softly, a sound I hadn't heard in years. I didn't know she said, not accusing, just stating a fact. "I know," I said. That afternoon, as we walked back to the car, the courthouse behind us, I thought about how easily people mistake quiet for weakness. I thought about the years my mother spent being underestimated, and the years I spent learning how systems work, not to dominate them, but to navigate them. The suit my father mocked was just cloth. What mattered was what I had learned while wearing it. After the hallway emptied and the echo of footsteps faded, the memory of my father's face stayed with me. Not the anger he'd worn that often, but the confusion. It followed me home that night, and it followed me back through years I rarely spoke about. I grew up in a modest house on a quiet street where nothing dramatic ever seemed to happen, at least from the outside. My father worked long hours and spoke often about responsibility. My mother kept the house running with a steadiness that went unnoticed because it never failed. Supper was always on the table, bills were always paid. When friends asked what my parents were like, I used to say normal. It took me a long time to realize that normal sometimes just means familiar. As a child, I learned early which moods were safe and which weren't. When my father came home tired, the house grew smaller. Conversations shortened. My mother would nod and say, "Of course," even when no question had been asked. I watched her do this for years, absorbing the lesson without understanding it. Authority in our home belonged to whoever spoke last and loudest. I was not a rebellious child. I did well in school, kept my head down, and learned how to disappear into books. My father liked to say I was easy. What he meant was that I didn't challenge him. I didn't ask for much. I learned that silence could be a form of peace, even if it wasn't happiness. When I left for college, my mother hugged me longer than usual. My father shook my hand and said, "Don't forget where you came from." I promised I wouldn't, though at the time I wasn't sure what that meant. I chose a state school not too far away and paid my way with scholarships and part-time work. I didn't call home often, not out of anger, out of habit. Distance felt like relief. The idea of law didn't come to me all at once. It arrived slowly through a series of small moments. A landlord dispute a friend couldn't navigate. A professor who explained contracts like puzzles instead of threats. A part-time job at a legal aid office where people came in scared and left calmer, not because their problems vanished, but because someone had listened. I realized I liked that feeling, bringing order to confusion, clarity to fear. When I told my parents I was applying to law school, my father laughed. Not cruelly, but dismissively, the way you laugh at a plan you don't intend to take seriously. "That's a lot of school," he said. "What for?" My mother smiled but said nothing. I answered honestly, because I want to understand how things work. He nodded, already bored. Law school was harder than anything I'd done before, but it was honest work. The rules were clear. Effort mattered. I didn't stand out, and I didn't try to. I learned to write precisely to argue without raising my voice, to let facts do their work. I graduated, passed the bar, and took a job that paid less than my classmates chasing big firms. I chose steady over flashy. I chose cases that ended with quiet thank yous instead of headlines. Through all of it, my parents remained on the periphery. My father told people I worked somewhere downtown. My mother asked careful questions when we spoke, never pressing. I could hear the years in her voice, the habit of not wanting to impose. The cracks in their marriage widened slowly. There was no single betrayal, no dramatic exit, just a steady erosion. My father's decisions became declarations. My mother's opinions became inconveniences. When she finally told me she wanted a divorce, her voice shook, not with fear of him, but with exhaustion. "I don't want to fight," she said. "I just want it to be fair." That word fair has weight when you've lived without it. I offered to help in the way I knew how, not as a daughter trying to punish a parent, but as a lawyer who understood the system, and as a woman who understood her mother. We talked through options. We talked through consequences. I made sure she knew she could say no. When she asked me to represent her, it wasn't dramatic. It was practical. "I trust you," she said. That was all. Preparing the case felt like assembling a life in documents. Years of shared decisions that only one person had controlled. Accounts opened without discussion. Assets moved quietly. Patterns that looked accidental until you lined them up. I didn't feel anger as I worked through it. I felt focus. On the morning of the hearing, I chose a suit that wouldn't draw attention, not out of fear but intention. I didn't want to announce myself. I wanted the work to speak. When my father sneered, it stung, but not because I doubted myself. It stung because it reminded me how easily he reduced people to appearances. How often my mother had been reduced that way. Standing in that courtroom answering the judge's question, I wasn't thinking about revenge. I was thinking about alignment, about finally standing where I belonged, using what I had learned for the reason I learned it. The past doesn't disappear when you confront it, but sometimes it loosens its grip. By the time the hearing resumed, the story of my parents' marriage had already been told, just not out loud. It lived in habits and silences, in decisions made without discussion, in the way one voice learned to wait for permission to speak. My parents met young. That mattered. They built their life the way people did then, with clear roles and few questions. My father worked, advanced, provided. My mother followed, supported, adjusted. In the early years it worked well enough. He was decisive, she was capable. Friends admired them for being steady. Stability can look like happiness when no one asks too closely. The trouble wasn't that my father was cruel. It was that he believed leadership meant control, and control meant certainty. He decided where they lived, how money moved, what risks were acceptable. My mother's objections were framed as worries, not disagreements, and worries were things to be managed, not answered. Over time, that distinction wore her down. I saw it during holidays when conversations circled the same safe topics. I heard it in phone calls that ended with my mother saying, "It's fine," in a voice that meant the opposite. When I visited, I noticed how she waited until my father left the room to ask simple questions about health insurance, about accounts, about what would happen if something went wrong. Nothing ever went wrong, according to my father. Bills were paid, the house stayed tidy, appearances held, but marriages don't collapse only under dramatic failures. Sometimes they thin out year by year until what remains is habit without partnership. When my father retired early, the imbalance grew. He was home more with more time to decide and less patience for negotiation. My mother's world narrowed. She stopped suggesting changes and started asking permission. She didn't use that word, but the meaning was there. Permission to visit friends. Permission to help grandchildren. Permission to spend money that was on paper shared. The night she told him she wanted a divorce, there was no shouting. She described it to me later in careful sentences, as if recounting a business meeting. She said she couldn't keep shrinking her life to fit his certainty. He laughed at first, then grew cold. He told her she didn't understand how things worked. He told her she would regret it. He also told her he would be fair. Promises like that sound generous until you understand who gets to define fair. When the paperwork began, my father moved quickly. Accounts shifted. Records were suddenly hard to find. His attorney spoke of tradition and contribution. My mother felt unmoored. She didn't want to accuse. She wanted to understand. That's when she called me, not in panic, but with resolve. "I need help," she said, "not to hurt him, to make sure I'm seen." In preparing the case, I learned things I wish I hadn't needed to learn. Not about my father's intentions, those were familiar, but about the quiet efficiency of control. Decisions justified as simpler this way. Assets described as mine because they were managed that way. Years of unspoken consent mistaken for agreement. In court, these patterns don't announce themselves. They have to be shown, carefully, respectfully. I organized timelines and summaries not to overwhelm but to clarify. I focused on access and participation, on what partnership means under the law. I avoided language that sounded like blame. I used language that sounded like facts. Watching my father listen was unsettling. He looked offended not by the allegations but by the idea that his certainty could be questioned. He expected loyalty from history itself. When the judge asked about decisions made unilaterally, my father answered confidently. He believed confidence would carry the day. What he didn't expect was my mother's steadiness. On the stand, she didn't recount grievances. She described processes, who decided, who was informed, who signed, who didn't. Her voice didn't shake. It had years of practice. I watched the judge's attention sharpen, not with drama but with recognition. This wasn't a battle of personalities. It was an examination of structure. During a brief recess, my father approached me in the hallway. He kept his voice low. "You didn't have to do this," he said, as if I'd violated a private agreement. "I did," I answered, equally quiet, "because she asked." He looked at me the way people look when they realize the rules they relied on no longer apply. There was no anger then, just recalibration. The hearing ended without a speech or a gavel slam. The judge took the matter under advisement. We would wait for a written decision. As we walked out, my mother squeezed my arm, not in triumph, in relief. That night alone, I thought about the stories we tell ourselves to survive. My father told himself he was fair because he provided. My mother told herself patience was loyalty. I told myself distance was neutrality. Each story held for a time, none held forever. Marriages end for many reasons, some loud, some quiet. What mattered here wasn't who won, but whether the truth had room to stand. For the first time, it did. When people imagine legal preparation, they picture strategy sessions and sharp exchanges. What they don't see are the quiet hours, the ones without witnesses, without applause, when the work actually happens. After the hearing, while we waited for the judge's decision, my days followed a steady rhythm. I rose early, made coffee, and spread documents across my dining table. Statements, deeds, retirement accounts, notes scribbled years ago and forgotten. Each piece told a small part of the same story. Together they formed a pattern. My mother sat with me sometimes, not to direct but to remember. She'd pause over a line item and say, "That was the year he switched banks." Or I asked about that once. She wasn't bitter, she was precise. That mattered. Precision keeps memory honest. I explained things as we went, not in legal language but in plain terms. I told her how courts look at partnership, not just income but access and participation. I explained that fairness isn't about punishment, it's about balance. She listened carefully, asked thoughtful questions, and took notes in a spiral notebook she'd had since before the separation. She liked to be prepared. She always had. In quieter moments, I reflected on how far we'd come without anyone noticing. There were no dramatic confrontations in those months, no declarations. Just steady preparation. I'd learned early in my career that the strongest cases are built quietly. Not because you're hiding, but because clarity takes time. My father, meanwhile, carried on with confidence. He told relatives the case was straightforward. He believed his long history of providing would speak for itself. I don't think it occurred to him that systems have memories longer than any one person's version of events. Paper remembers what people forget. One afternoon, as I organized exhibits, my phone rang. It was a former colleague who specialized in family law. We spoke briefly, nothing confidential, just to check in. Before hanging up, she said something that stayed with me. "People think preparation is about winning," she said. "It's really about making sure the truth doesn't get lost." That was exactly it. Preparing without applause also meant preparing emotionally. I reminded myself daily that this wasn't about settling old scores. It was about standing in the right place when it mattered. When you represent someone you love, boundaries become even more important. I was careful to remain measured. I reviewed my own drafts critically. I asked myself hard questions. Would I make this argument for any client? Was this evidence relevant or just personal? That discipline kept me steady. I also thought often about the audience beyond the courtroom, the people who never file motions or read statutes, but live with the consequences of decisions made quietly around them. Especially women my mother's age who were taught to be grateful rather than included. I hoped in some small way that our case might show what fairness looks like when it's patiently assembled. When the decision arrived, it came by mail, as these things often do. No fanfare. Just a thick envelope and careful language. The judge's reasoning was clear, balanced. He acknowledged contributions beyond income. He emphasized shared decision-making as a measure of partnership. The outcome wasn't punitive, it was equitable. My mother read the decision slowly. When she finished, she closed the folder and exhaled. "I feel seen," she said. That was everything. We met my father once more weeks later to finalize details. The tension had softened, not disappeared but shifted. He spoke less. He listened more. At one point he looked at me and said, "I didn't know you were this prepared." It wasn't an apology. It was recognition. Sometimes that's as close as people get. In the months that followed, life found a new rhythm. My mother moved into a smaller place closer to friends. She planted herbs on the balcony. She laughed more easily. I returned to my practice carrying the quiet satisfaction that comes from work done carefully and well. Preparation without applause taught me something lasting. That dignity isn't loud, that justice often arrives on plain paper, and that the most meaningful victories are the ones that leave room for healing. We didn't rewrite the past, we clarified it, and in doing so we made space for something gentler to follow. The day the judge announced his decision, the courtroom felt different. Not tense exactly, more attentive, as if everyone sensed that something quiet but final was about to happen. We arrived early. My mother sat beside me, hands folded, her posture straight. She wore a simple blouse and slacks, nothing new, nothing symbolic. Across the aisle, my father spoke in low tones with his attorney. He looked composed, but the ease he'd carried before was gone. He nodded often, as if reassurance were something he now needed to borrow. When the judge took the bench, the room rose and settled again. He didn't waste time. He summarized the case in measured language, referencing facts rather than feelings. He spoke of long marriages, of contributions that don't always show up on tax returns. He talked about access to information and shared decision-making as markers of partnership. His voice was calm, but each sentence carried weight. As he spoke, I watched my father. At first, he leaned forward, confident that familiarity would favor him. But as the judge continued, something shifted. My father's shoulders dropped slightly. His attorney stopped writing and listened. The room seemed to narrow, not physically but in focus. When the judge addressed the division of assets, he did so without accusation. He acknowledged my father's income and effort. He also acknowledged my mother's years of unpaid labor, her role in maintaining stability, her lack of access to key decisions. The balance he described wasn't dramatic, it was deliberate. This court finds, the judge said, that an equitable distribution must reflect both contribution and participation. My mother closed her eyes briefly, not in triumph, in relief. The decision wasn't everything my father wanted, nor was it everything my mother could have asked for. It was fair. That mattered. The judge concluded with a reminder that divorce is not a judgment of character, but a restructuring of responsibility. He encouraged cooperation going forward. The gavel came down softly. The hearing was over. In the silence that followed, no one spoke. We gathered our papers. Chairs scraped. The routine sounds of conclusion filled the space where tension had been. Outside in the hallway, my father approached us. He looked older than I remembered, the certainty that once framed him now thinner at the edges. He didn't address me at first. He spoke to my mother. "I didn't think it would go like this," he said. She nodded. Neither did I. There was no apology, there was no argument, just acknowledgement. He turned to me then. "You're thorough," he said, choosing the word carefully. I met his gaze. "That's the job." He nodded once and stepped back. His attorney murmured something about next steps. They walked away together, their conversation low and private. My mother leaned against the wall and laughed softly. It surprised both of us. "I'm tired," she said, "but lighter." We went for coffee afterward, a small ritual that felt earned. Sitting at a corner table, she talked about ordinary things, plants she wanted to buy, a friend she planned to visit. The future not as a grand plan, but as a series of manageable steps. As we sat there, I thought about the shift that had taken place, not just in the courtroom, but within the story my father had always told himself. Control had been his language, certainty his shield. That day, he'd encountered a system that spoke differently. Not loudly, clearly. For me, the shift was quieter still. I felt no surge of victory, no satisfaction in his discomfort. What I felt was alignment. I had stood where I belonged and spoken in the voice I'd spent years developing. The law had done what it's meant to do when it works well. It had balanced the scales without tipping them too far. In the weeks that followed, the practical work continued. Documents were signed, accounts adjusted. Each task was small, but together they marked the transition from conflict to closure. My father complied without resistance. My mother asked questions and received answers. The pattern had changed. Looking back, I understand that the real turning point wasn't the judge's decision, though it mattered. It was the moment the room recalibrated, when laughter stopped and listening began. When assumptions met structure. When power shifted from appearance to substance. That shift doesn't erase the past, it reframes it. As I watched my mother step into a life with more space and fewer permissions, I felt a quiet gratitude for the systems that, when engaged, patiently can correct imbalances long taken for granted. And I felt something else too, a readiness for what came next, whatever shape it took. The building emptied quickly after the decision, as courthouses tend to do. People have places to go once the weight lifts. My mother and I lingered a moment on the steps, the late afternoon light slanting across the stone. She stood there quietly, as if taking inventory of her breath. "Thank you," she said finally. Not formally, not dramatically, just the words placed carefully between us. I nodded. "You did the hard part." She smiled at that, a small smile that held years in it. We parted ways for the evening, agreeing to talk the next day about practical matters, addresses, utilities, the slow work of disentangling a shared life. I drove home alone, the radio off, letting the day settle. That night I slept deeply, not from exhaustion but from release. In the days that followed, the world returned to its ordinary pace. Emails needed answering, clients needed calls returned, groceries still had to be bought. Justice, when it arrives quietly, doesn't interrupt life so much as make room within it. A week later, my father called. The sound of his voice on my phone surprised me. We hadn't spoken directly since the hearing. There was a pause after I said hello long enough that I could hear his breathing. "I thought we should talk," he said. "All right," I answered. We agreed to meet at a diner halfway between our homes, a place we'd stopped at countless times when I was younger. Vinyl booths, bottomless coffee, familiar neutral ground. He arrived early. When I walked in, he stood, then sat again, unsure of the gesture. We ordered coffee and nothing else. For a moment we talked about the weather, about traffic, the safe things. Then he looked at me and said, "I didn't realize how much I didn't know." It wasn't an apology, it wasn't defiance. It was something rarer, an admission without defense. I waited. "I thought providing was enough," he continued. "I thought decisions were my responsibility because I was good at them." He paused, stirring his coffee, though it didn't need it. I didn't see how much that shut other people out. I considered my response carefully. The temptation to catalog old hurts was there, but I let it pass. This wasn't a courtroom. This was a conversation, and conversations require space. "You weren't wrong to want stability," I said, "but stability isn't the same as partnership." He nodded slowly. "Your mother used to say something like that. I didn't listen." Silence settled between us, not uncomfortable, just full. For the first time I noticed how much older he looked. Not diminished, just human, stripped of the armor certainty provides. "I'm not asking you to take sides now," he said. "I know where you stood. I just wanted you to know I see it differently." That mattered more than he realized. In the weeks that followed, the legal aftermath concluded. Documents were finalized. Accounts were divided. The process was orderly, almost anticlimactic. My mother moved into her new place, a sunlit apartment near the library. She invited me over for dinner one evening and showed me where she planned to put her books. She had opinions now about paint colors, about schedules. She was learning to speak without waiting. My father adjusted too in his way. He asked questions he'd never asked before, about my work, about my choices. He didn't always agree, but he listened. When disagreements arose, they stayed contained, no longer spilling into declarations. What struck me most was how small the steps toward reconciliation were. No grand gestures, no speeches, just consistency. Respect practiced daily. One afternoon, sorting old papers with my mother, I found a photo of the three of us from years ago. We looked ordinary. Happy maybe, or at least hopeful. I realized then that reconciliation isn't about returning to that image. It's about building something new with the people you are now. My mother, for her part, didn't rush forgiveness. She accepted cooperation. She accepted civility. Over time, she accepted conversation. Each acceptance was a choice, not an obligation. Watching her choose taught me more than any statute ever could. As a lawyer, I'm trained to look for outcomes. As a daughter, I learned to value process. The case had ended, but its lessons continued to unfold. Power. I understood now isn't taken away so much as redistributed when fairness is applied. And reconciliation doesn't erase accountability. It rests on it. On a quiet evening months later, my father and mother sat at the same table again, discussing logistics for a family gathering. Their tone was neutral, even warm. They were no longer a couple, but they were no longer adversaries. That mattered. I thought back to the courtroom, the laughter, the question, the stillness. That moment hadn't been an ending. It had been a door. Some doors opened to confrontation, others opened to understanding. This one unexpectedly had done both. Time has a way of softening sharp edges without erasing their shape. Months passed after the papers were signed, after accounts were settled and routines reset. Life did not transform overnight, but it steadied. That steadiness felt like a gift. My mother settled into her new apartment, as if she had always lived there. She learned the rhythm of the building, the best hours for sunlight, the quiet corners of the nearby park. She hosted small dinners, nothing elaborate, just soups and casseroles and conversation that didn't require permission. When she spoke now, she didn't look to anyone else to finish her thoughts. She finished them herself. I watched this change with a kind of quiet pride, not because I had caused it, but because I had witnessed its possibility. Independence, I learned, doesn't announce itself. It accumulates in small choices made consistently. My father and I found a new footing, too. It was tentative at first. Conversations stayed practical. Over time, they widened. He asked about my work and listened to the answers. He asked about my mother without defensiveness. He learned slowly that listening could be an act of strength rather than surrender. One afternoon, while we were walking through his neighborhood, he stopped and said, "I used to think respect came from being right." He paused, searching for words. "Now I think it comes from being willing to learn." It wasn't an apology, not in the traditional sense, but it was a reckoning. For a man who had spent decades equating certainty with leadership, it was no small shift. As a lawyer, I returned fully to my practice. The case with my family did not make me famous. It did not change the law. But it changed me. I became more patient with clients who were afraid, more deliberate in explaining processes that can feel overwhelming. I remembered how intimidating a courtroom can be when you believe the outcome is already decided. For those listening who have never been inside one, I want to say this plainly: the law is not perfect, but it is not the enemy. It is a tool. Like any tool, it reflects the care with which it's used. When approached calmly and honestly, it can correct imbalances that feel immovable. It can give voice to people who have learned to wait. The moment that began this story, the laughter, the question, the stillness has taken on a different meaning for me now. At the time, it felt like revelation. In hindsight, it was a checkpoint, a reminder that appearances rarely tell the whole story and that respect is not owed to volume. Revenge was never the point. If anything, the experience taught me how hollow revenge can be. What lasts is accountability. What heals is recognition. What restores is fairness applied without spectacle. Reconciliation, too, is often misunderstood. It doesn't require forgetting or excusing. It requires honesty and boundaries and a willingness to meet people where they are now, not where you wish they had been. In our family, reconciliation looked like measured conversations, mutual respect, and the freedom to disagree without fear. I share this story not to elevate myself, but to offer a reflection. Many of you listening have lived long lives. You have navigated marriages, raised children, made compromises, and endured silences. You know that change rarely comes from grand gestures. It comes from steady choices. If there is one lesson I carry forward, it is this: dignity grows when people are heard. Whether in a courtroom, a kitchen, or a quiet diner, listening can shift the balance more than any declaration. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of your own experiences or gave you something to think about, I invite you to pause for a moment. Reflect on the quiet strengths in your life. Share this story with someone who might need to hear it. And if you choose to stay with this channel to listen to more stories like this, consider subscribing. Not for drama, but for understanding. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your time. And thank you for carrying these reflections forward into your own conversations.